Colleagues, Anthony McKay, and I have the pleasure and the honour of being your moderator for the opening session of a very significant OECD SERI International Conference, Digital Education for a Strong Recovery, a Forward Look. And colleagues, all of you who have joined us would be aware that we have got the opportunity in this opening session to launch a very crucial document, a report, Digital Education Outlook, that will give us a sense of what the promise can be of harnessing the power of technology for powerful learning systems. We are delighted to welcome you across multiple jurisdictions, and we know that a number of other organisations that I will mention have supported this international conference, and I will certainly acknowledge them toward the end of this opening session. But in order to launch us into what I know is going to be a fascinating series of sessions over the coming days, I'd like to welcome, obviously, the Deputy Secretary-General, Nutsen, and ask if you would take us into the opening session. Thank you, Deputy Secretary-General.
Thank you very much, moderator Anthony. Thank you, colleagues. Good morning, everyone, or maybe we're bordering good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to welcome all of you to the opening of this international conference. We decided to call it Digital Education for a Strong Recovery, as the moderator said. And as he also said, we are equally excited today to share with you the launch of our new OECD flagship publication, the Digital Education Outlook, pushing the frontiers with AI, blockchain, and robots. And my thanks also to the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation for organizing this event. Now, life today is, of course, as you all know, very different to what anyone could have imagined just 2 decades ago. Internet, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, Internet of Things, big data, virtual reality have all completely changed how we live, how we work, and perhaps most importantly today, how we learn. Digital technologies transform businesses and markets. They transform the nature of work and also the demand for skills. When students when students were locked down due to the COVID-19 pandemic, digital technologies actually also played a very crucial role in keeping these students connected to their schools. Last year, 1.5 billion students in 188 countries were locked out of their schools for either a few days and some up to several months. During school closures, remote learning technologies became suddenly the lifeline for education, and the pandemic really pushed teachers and students to very quickly adapt to teach and learn online. The crisis has, we have to admit, exposed many inadequacies, many inequities in our school systems, from the lack of broadband and computers needed for online education, through teachers and students perhaps underpreparedness for new ways of teaching and learning. The pandemic has thus revealed that our education systems have been surprisingly slow to adopt to the most advanced digital technologies. That's one side of the coin, but the other one is, of course, that the pandemic also accelerated us perhaps a decade forward in the use of digital technologies in education, and perhaps also in understanding their importance to provide better value for money for society in the future. So as we look towards the post-COVID-19 recovery, digital technologies hold a great promise for the future of education. Let me just mention 4 areas, and you could mention many more, of course, but the 4 that we have chosen to focus on today are: 1, and I mean digital technologies, are the best opportunity to provide access to quality education and training to large, historically excluded populations around the globe. 2, they will allow educators and learners to acknowledge or to access knowledge in many formats in ways that can bridge time and space. 3, they allow truly brilliant, outstanding teachers to inspire millions of learners around the world. And at the same time, technology can support new ways of teaching that focus on learners as active participants. 4, technology can build communities of learners and make learning more social and perhaps also more fun. Collaborative learning enhances goal orientation, motivation, persistence, and the development of effective learning strategies. But to leverage the potential of educational technologies, we need to rethink the role of teachers and reorganize common teaching practices. In fact, a number of important elements must go along with the introduction of new ways of teaching and learning. First, effective integration of technology into teaching requires technological competence and confidence of teachers. In a context where lower secondary teachers consider ICT skills as the second most important professional development need, more effort should be made in this direction. Second, the effectiveness of digital technologies in education depends on how they're used. Having access to them is not enough. The actual use that teachers make of technology and their ability to integrate it into their teaching to reach their learning goals is what really counts. So digital technologies will not make teachers redundant, but will certainly transform the role of teachers. They will become high value added tutors and facilitators assisted by algorithms and tools that use AI and big data. These tools could assist teachers in their administrative work, in their assessment of learning outcomes. They could replace the teacher in answering routine questions from students, and free their time to work with students on areas that really only a human can address. In the end, the quality of teaching will remain the most valuable asset of modern educational institutions. Education systems must evolve to reap the benefits of digital technologies and be able to prepare today's children for a journey of lifelong learning. Countries need to have a clear plan and build teachers' capacity to make just that happen. So I'm glad to see that this conference brings together students, teachers, ministers, international organizations, policymakers, entrepreneurs, researchers, and developers internationally. I really hope that your discussions will advance us in this ambitious undertaking. So I wish you a very productive conference, and I look forward to hearing about its outcomes. Thank you very much, and back to you, moderator.
Ulrich, thank you very much. As you say, the challenges here, the opportunities for the teaching profession are absolutely in our minds as we explore the report. But of course, as you've also indicated, front and centre are young people themselves, learners. And Henry, I'd like you just to set the scene to hear young people's voices and the way in which they are thinking about technology in education.
We are part of the generation that is living a pandemic. From kindergarten to high-level education had to include online classes.
We still receive an education, which is a true privilege. We also had a lot of innovation in the classroom, for which I am infinitely grateful to my professors and to the support and decision-making staff at the university. So they could integrate various new multimedia methods. They could look into how to integrate student perspectives, student ideas in the curriculum. So the whole curriculum became much more of a co-creational space, in my experience, through the digitalization elements.
It was really hard for me to not have this face-to-face contact with my professor, and I think that's the negative side of technology, that sometimes you just lose that connection that could be so wonderful.
It's also, I think, challenging just with the insane amount of screen time that we've had for students. I think it can get a bit tiring, and I think 30 or 40 minutes into the lecture, my eyes are so shot and my brain is so tired of screens that I just tune out in a way that I wouldn't necessarily do if I was in person.
I feel like through the computer, you just lose all the class dynamic and the interactions you can have with both your classmates and your teacher. But it depends what kind of person you are.
I, for example, cannot spend all day at the computer, starting with lectures, then homework, and then something else. I start to feel numb and unmotivated, and every day is starting to become the same.
We're humans with feelings, emotions, and thoughts. So we should start thinking about that. Sometimes interacting through a screen, for example, is kind of limited. So some solutions that are now emerging, like these virtual events, where 3D technology takes the concept of virtual community to the next level.
I definitely see the point about how it can complement teaching activities and aid teachers. At the same time, I think the point is really important that AI and more advanced technologies should not crowd out the creativity of teachers and should not come as a substitute to human interactions, because those are still more enriching than technology can provide, in my experience. Higher creativity, more independence, more flexibility, and more real interactions. I understand it's vague, but I would explain it in a way that we interact with humans. It is imperative that we don't lose our emotional intelligence for the sake of gaining more, perhaps the IQ type of intelligence, with more classic intelligence.
I like it when teachers not only present their class, but they actually use tools like Kahoot or different games with technology. So you feel more involved, and not the teacher giving the class, but you actually being part of it. So that's the way I like it the most, when you can interact with them.
The way in which I think my experience with digitalization in education was enriching would be the connection that it would provide us with knowledge from various disciplines, from across disciplines, from various sources, from various authors who come from very different walks of life and geographical locations that we come from.
Most schools use a software called DingTalk to teach online. At the end of each class, the teacher can judge the attendance according to the length of students' watching time. Not only that, DingTalk also has the function of live playback, which can repeatedly consolidate the knowledge points for students with poor foundation. For me, I sometimes play back the math live to improve my math.
In my experience, when I've had teachers who have really done something new or different with technology, those instances have been rather rare. The one example that comes to mind, one class that I took in the fall of 2020, where the professor used an online platform that allowed students to respond to questions that you would pose on a shared screen, and then we could see people's answers in real time. It wasn't, anything particularly different or special, but I thought that it was a good way to make sure that the class remained engaged.
I think the teacher can make a huge difference in terms of incorporating technology into a classroom. I don't think it would be fair to expect them to be on top of every new technology and to always constantly be incorporating it into a curriculum, because that is a lot to ask. But where they can and where they see that it might enrich learning, I think teachers should make use of new technologies and try to reach their students in perhaps different ways and see how they respond to that.
George Carter said, "Technology will never replace great teachers, but in the hands of great teachers, it's transformational."
There's one message I have for world leaders in education. I would say that no matter what new technologies are implemented or new strategies, to always keep in mind that education is to be for all, and so everything has to be done while keeping in mind who's missing from the conversation and who could most benefit from it. So I would love to see new technologies being implemented, not only in the global north or the west, but also how we can bring that to other countries and how we can bridge education gaps and make that accessible to all.
There are kids or teenagers that don't have the resources the access to information, or the use of technology that they can even finish their studies. My question is, what can we do, or what will happen with those kids? I know that it's a difficult topic. There's a lot of things to change that concern us, but we as a community and the world leaders that play an important role in all of this need to think and find a way to reconstruct the system. There's a quote that I liked when I heard it that in my language says, "No dejes que el privilegio te nuble la empatía." The translation in English will be, "Don't let privilege blind your empathy."
I think something that I'd really want to stress is this area of accessibility, and I think it's not one that we think about enough. Especially given the pandemic, we were forced to switch into this virtual world, but sometimes that made it more difficult for people with disabilities. I think a lot of the screen time can be difficult for people with disabilities. There's other accessibility challenges as well that come from a lecture format that mean that people with disabilities don't always get the attention that they need in a classroom setting. The individualized attention, or teachers noticing that some students are falling behind, or some students are, not fully understanding the material. So I think that's something that educators and politicians or policymakers really need to think a lot about when we're thinking about technology in education.
There should definitely be a balance and listen to the students on how they react to it and how they're actually learning with it. And if they want to start using more technology in schools, I would definitely say train the teachers better, because all they're doing is using what they usually do, but just putting an iPad in the way, and it does not work because those are two different, completely different things.
Something I wish to say to educational leaders that has been enriching in my own experience while studying at university was the great regard and great involvement of student voices in decision making. I understand that it is sometimes difficult to be accountable, and it is sometimes difficult to include the diversity of voices, because those conversations can be truly uncomfortable. But embracing that discomfort and engaging with the diversity of views will, I believe, give a lot of new avenues to act, avenues that had not been anticipated yet.
I would like to say to the leaders of education that, on one hand, more use of technology will allow us to have more portability and a more dynamic interaction between students and teachers, for instance, but that also, on the other hand, we will forever need a human interaction when it comes to education. Thus, I guess they just have to remember that the most important thing is learning.
Well, colleagues and Andreas, let me welcome you, Director for Education and Skills. Andreas Schleicher, you'd have to say that we've had a set of key messages there that clearly have informed a flagship report because it resonates strongly with many of the findings that I think are part of Digital Education Outlook, pushing the frontiers with AI, blockchain, and robots. So Andreas, great to have you with us, and we're looking forward to your capturing of the key findings of this very significant report. Andreas, welcome.
Thanks so much, Tony, and it's such a pleasure to present our Digital Education Outlook today. And my special thanks to Stéphane Vincent-Lacrande and his team, who's been the mastermind of this work and who's brought a really amazing range of experts together to make this work happen. When I started my work at the OECD, and I admit it was a long time ago, it seemed entirely futuristic to imagine, I could video chat with people halfway around the world. But it was actually possible then. We just didn't do it. When you hear me talking about, artificial intelligence, robots, blockchain technology and education, now maybe that has a futuristic feel for many of us, but actually that future is here now, as the Outlook really shows. And if you don't feel quite ready for it, your students are. Even before the pandemic, they spent an average of 35 hours per week on the internet. And in Denmark and Sweden, it was close to 50 hours. And a large chunk of which in school. You see that marked here in yellow. So For your students, the digital world is already the real world. But, being a digital native doesn't mean that you are digitally skilled. Here you see the share of 15-year-olds who are highly effective navigators on the internet, or at least capable to, actively and systematically explore information. And as you can see, there's no country in the Western world with at least half of the student population good at navigating the digital world. Some students have limited navigation skills, but often a majority do not even demonstrate basic navigation skills. So technology seems way ahead of the capacities of humans, students, teachers included. And you can say the same about our education systems. Think how technology has revolutionized everything. In 2007 came the smartphone, then social media made us all authors and publishers, and now robotics, cloud computing, artificial intelligence change the equation once again. But when it comes to equipping 15-year-olds with the capacity to access, manage, navigate, validate digital knowledge, our PISA assessments show that school systems in 2018 look pretty much the same as back in 2000. Now, less than half of 15-year-olds could reliably distinguish fact from opinion. What I want to say here is that it's time to approach things differently. And using technology to conserve existing practice, as one of the students just said, is not the way to change this. We need to use technology to transform practice. And that's exactly what this outlook is about. It looks how technology can help in classrooms, personalize learning, improve student engagement, understanding the dynamics in a class through learning analytics, improve equity, particular for students with special needs. And for education systems as a whole, technology can tell us more when students fall behind. It can better support students and teachers and manage also accreditation, logistics, things like that. Let's look at the classroom first. Basically, here the most obvious potential of technology is to make learning more personal, more granular, more adaptive, more interactive. If you are building a self-driving car, you need to track the environment, diagnose risks, and then, think what you want to do. In the same way, AI can support teachers to follow learners and track their environment, diagnose learners, anticipate how they develop, and then advise on how to best advance learning. Smart systems have become really good at using a range of data to understand both learners and learning. Log data from student activities on the computer, you can track all of this physiological data, behavioral data, and then contextual data. And with those data streams, we can then support diagnosis, assessing student learning progressions, spotting gaps in student development, gauging motivation, and also increasingly understand students' emotions. And that diagnosis can then help teachers adjust their input, their feedback, their interaction with the students. Algorithms have become actually quite good at adjusting tasks based on students' capabilities. Math AI is in an adaptive learning program. It finds out how students progress with the math problem. It diagnoses student knowledge growth and learning progression, but also the type of errors that students make, and then can figure out when a student has really mastered the topic. And it then provides very detailed feedback at the step level where the student is. And teachers get a planning report at the more macro level. And similar technology can then optimize the order in which students work on different topics. So you get to the curriculum level. Take Alex, a program that adjusts selections of units for students based on their previous performance. And so essentially, you can move from one curriculum for all students to getting the right curriculum for every student and for every learning style. And those technologies are particularly valuable for educating students with special needs. Here, teachers can quite, in real time, recognize differences in children's development, detect and diagnose things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and also some hearing or visual impairments. Take autism. Social and communication difficulties are one of the hallmarks of autism, and computers are really good at providing a non-threatening environment for students to learn that. For example, Echoes is a virtual learning environment designed to scaffold autistic children's exploration and learning of social communication skills. With an interesting series of playful learning activities. And then there are simpler things like using smartphones to add auditory and tactile features to visuals. Lots of things that we can be doing. And one of the things that we all observed during the pandemic is, of course, that technology only works well when students are motivated and have access to the right self-management and also learning strategies. We just heard that from the students. And actually, the reality is engaging in a course is difficult, and engaging in an online course is even more difficult. And sometimes liking and learning are at odds. Engagement doesn't automatically lead to learning. And, engagement can also mean very different things. Do you mean showing up, completing your homework, feelings of belongings, having fun? And engagement is something that in the Outlook we define as a multidimensional social construct. And then based on that construct, sensors can capture students' movements, their posture, their facial expression, and those data can then be turned into measures of engagement. For example, eye gaze can detect when students are zoning out, and the analysis of facial features and body movements can signal students' affect. In fact, machines can be trained to infer how interested a student is in the class from such machine-readable figures. Now, our Outlook looks at two technologies to do that. There are proactive approaches. They sense when students get disengaged and then try to re-engage them in learning. You have Classcraft, which helps students to do homework and to stay on homework. You have Crystal Island, an immersive game that uses an interactive world to embed learning of microbiology and the development of inquiry learning skills in a really engaging narrative framework. And then we also describe reactive approaches, where you monitor student engagement and then you intervene when disengagement occurs or, is likely. An example for that here is gaze tutors. Now, the power of technology comes not just from personalizing learning for individual students, but even more when you put all of those data together and learn something about the classroom dynamics. Using technology, we can view whole classrooms as digital systems that capture what's going on. That can be everything from students' interaction with their devices to the whole class attention level as determined by eye tracking software, heart frequency sensors, or whatever input you use. And then learner analytics can integrate all of this, put it together, help teachers make sense of what's going on, sort of to make the invisible visible. Give you a couple of examples. Teachers can use those insights for monitoring and intervention, for sharing information, for building, composing student teams, managing transitions. Here, for example, one of the most difficult issues in teaching is always, finding out where your students are. Now, if you advance too quickly, you leave students behind. If you advance too slowly, you get many people bored. And here you see a dashboard that integrates all of the student data and shows you the percentage of students who are doing an activity at each point in time. That's the blue line. And then the percentage of students who have completed the activity at that time in red. And the plain lines on the left is what we observe, and then the rest is what we predict. So you are a teacher and you get a sense of where your students are. You can see that you would have on this chart, 95% of your class complete the activity after 300 seconds, and you need another 100 seconds if you want everyone to complete it. So suddenly you can project the use of time and waste, which would be very difficult to do without. And in the same way, teachers can use technology to learn more about themselves. How much they speak, where they move, which students they pay most attention to. And in this example, the teacher can see she spent much more time on the left side with students than on the right side of the classroom. So the most lively controversy is about robots in education. And that's also where our Outlook tries to sort of disentangle the promise from the hype. Now, artificial intelligence doesn't need a body, no? Despite what popular culture always makes us believe. Most of the systems I showed you so far actually are just a processor and a screen. But, our results show that giving AI a body can actually make learning different. Maybe it's not yet what you see in the movies, but the lifelike behavior of robots appeals to children, and social robots can support social interaction and engagement, and they can also inject some fun, boost students' attention, motivation, things like this. See some really good examples of one-to-one tutoring. Good examples are language learning robots, which help students learn a language through interaction rather than just, learning lists of vocabularies or grammar tables. You have also robots that act as assistants to teachers. Get rid of administrative burden or help teachers interact with a class split in groups. Now, here's an example where English was taught with the help of a robot assistant. And when compared with a paired group that was taught just by a teacher, the group with the robot assistant actually showed greater vocabulary gain. So there are some really interesting insights from this. A really interesting feature for robots is also that of a peer learner. The idea builds on learning by teaching. The idea that when you explain something to somebody else, that reinforces your own understanding. We find some interesting examples of that. And then, you have telepresence robots that become teachers' avatars in the classroom. And there have been actually interesting field trials in Australia, in Japan, and results from Japan showed that students felt the classroom atmosphere better under control in the presence of an avatar. And also they were actually quite positive about it. And think about it during COVID. Robots are just so much more advanced than traditional teleconferencing tools that are just passive. So interesting application in that field as well. So that gave you a taste of what technology can do in the classroom. Let's have a brief look at how technology can transform institutions and systems. And I'm not going to talk about the management of infrastructure. Let's take that for granted. Let's get into the more interesting applications. Early warning systems can help signal when students are at risk of dropping out. Technology can make admission processes more efficient, but also more equitable, or, help better allocate resources. For example, in the US, only 38% of actual school dropouts correspond to what you normally consider to be at-risk students. Now, what colleges call jaded dropout. So with our traditional views, we miss out on the most important categories of dropouts. Quiet dropouts who actually like school, but they somehow progress too slowly, and one day they lose the connection. That's actually the majority of dropouts. Or involved dropouts who like school, who actually also have good grades, but they take a wrong turn in their life at some point and then drop out. Technology can help us actually detect those patterns early on and then intervene. Here's an example of software that shows teachers exactly where students fall behind and how they can intervene in time rather than, letting things get worse that students have no chance to catching up. Now, technology has also huge potential to transform assessment and exams. Now, one of the worst mistakes in education that we ever made was to divorce learning from assessment. Now, you have students pile up lots and lots of learning, and then one day you ask them to come back and say, reproduce all of that in a very narrow, constrained, contrived environment. Now, it doesn't work very well. Technology can help us reintegrate learning and assessment. We describe game-based assessment, that sort of blur the line between traditional assessment and really engaging learning environment. They maximize the flow. They reward students for demonstrating cognitive processes rather than just for memorizing facts. They apply modern psychological theory to assessment. They integrate formative and summative elements. They measure hard-to-measure skills. So I think a lot of promise in there, but our outlook concludes it's sort of still in its infancy. It would require a lot of further research and investment to really bring that to scale. And also, assessment really only reach their potential in the digital world if we combine them with blockchain technology. Blockchains allow us to take, direct ownership of digital credentials, both by the issuers and the recipients. They remove dependencies on the universities or schools that issue the certifications or on software providers. So people will always own verifiable versions of their records, and they can share them with whoever they like in an open blockchain. And that gives learners so much greater ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. It could sort of also make learning at the workplace an integral part of learning. So I think that's what we still need. And in a way, we're not there yet quite. Policy also needs to do some homework. As you can read in the Outlook, we should ensure that legislation provides overarching frameworks rather than just being tied to specific applications. And we should also ensure that blockchain networks keep sort of in sync with the world of global standards, like the W3C or the IEEE or ISO and others, to ensure that what is developed works actually across countries and software platforms. At the moment, we still have a very fragmented kind of environment here. So what does it all mean? Now, basically, the Outlook shows you how much technology has to offer to improve effectiveness of teaching and learning, to enhance equity with greater learner diversity, and to help us reconfigure the spaces, the time, the technology to leverage better learning. So that future is really here. We have an amazing range of opportunities to use technology, not just to conserve existing practice, but to really transform it. But the reality looks like this. PISA still shows that the more students use technology in classrooms, the poorer they actually come out in PISA when we test digital literacy. And that's true whether you talk about playing simulations at school or doing homework or using learning apps or websites. And it's true across countries and across cultures pretty much. Now, there are lots of reasons how you can explain this. And surely the pandemic has made a difference. But, we also need to ask ourselves, why do we still have such a hard time with technology in education? I know it's easy to point finger at others, teachers who don't have the right skills, technology companies that use the education market to sell, dysfunctional products or whatever. But, I think we also need to ask ourselves, the deeper questions. And what we find really is that neither the industry nor even public policy today take much of an interest in an ecosystems approach to technology. We have a patchwork of solutions where the whole does not transcend beyond its parts. When you buy a television, you expect that when you plug it in, you can watch BBC, CNN, whatever you're interested in. In education, schools have to rely on proprietary and often incompatible partial solutions, and on different schools and districts, make different decisions. So you cannot put the data together. You cannot harness the data to help students learn better, teachers teach better, and schools to become more effective. And in this fragmented market, companies then need an army of sales people to bring their products to schools. And that, creates unsurmountable barriers for the entry of innovators and startups. We have lots of stories about this. And, public policy hasn't also helped very much to reconcile data privacy with an effective use of data. That's really the reality. So what can we do? Policy needs to do better with smart regulation, reconciling the ethics, transparency, data protection with the needs of learners, putting learners at the center. Policy needs to advance from a mentality of public versus private to a mentality of public with private here. And most importantly, technological solutions will only work if the education profession is really at the heart of their design. And where you don't engage teachers in the research, in the design around technology, they cannot and will not help you with implementation. We also need to work towards better integration of pedagogical approaches. Now, why should a teacher bet on a single digital tool when the future really is about smart and integrated systems? Governments should push the industry harder towards increasing compatibility between different technologies. Now, we need to better connected, more integrated digital tools. Now, we also need to shift attention from learning technology to learning activity and aim for the integration of individual, team, class-wide activities with the digital environments. And last but not least, the hardware needs to evolve as well so that devices become more present but are less visible to students and less destructive of students. And we need to adopt a more holistic development of smart systems that blend human and artificial intelligence. We need smart systems that work for all and that have sort of adaptivity and personalization deeply at their core. That encode, disability level customization, school level customization, and learner level customization. And ultimately, it's about ensuring that technology remains human-centered. You can see these days how our cars get automated, from driving the car in full autonomy to technology assisting you until you sit back and relax when technology pretty much takes over. And that's okay. But when it comes to education, we need to more carefully reflect on what is the appropriate balance and role of educators and technology. Now, learning is not a transactional process, as our students reminded us. It's a social, a relational process. And we see in our outlook how technology can provide supportive information to teachers, how it can advance to control specific tasks or even take over larger tasks. And you have seen there are applications where technology takes over some tasks completely. But where on that spectrum do we want to end up? It'll take, smart teachers, smart technology, and smart policies to figure that out. And our digital outlook offers some principles to get this right. It's about clear human-centered and learner-centered vision for the analytics, and to have them, deliberately designed with educators at the heart. We have to have a good understanding of the organizational, the political, the technological factors that will shape implementation. We need a good strategic plan that sets out the short-term and the long-term wins, but also the risks. And we need to clarity on how to build the organizational, the technical, the staff capacities to make all of this work. Now, smart education is really about a quite radical reimagination of what teaching and learning can be when it is powered well by technology. Hybrid human-machine systems will never replace teachers, but they can support teachers in, reinventing themselves as designers of learning experience, as mentors, as coaches, as tutors, as peers. To make all of that work, we also need a more level playing field for innovation in schools. Government, can strengthen professional autonomy, a collaborative culture where great ideas are, built, refined, developed, shared. Government also are needed, obviously, to help with funding, and they can offer incentives that raise the profile of what works. But governments alone can only do so much. Silicon Valley works because, governments provide the conditions, the enabling conditions for innovation, not because they do the innovation. The innovation can only help at the front line. And governments can help us, open up that space to innovators inside the system, but also more to innovators outside the system. Now, that's really what is so central. And ultimately, we need greater investment in innovation in education. Global education venture capital remains tiny when compared with other sectors. And when you look at evolution, progress is mainly a story about China. Now, in 2014, over half of global education venture capital was in the US. In 2020, China's shares had risen to 36%, and you can barely see Europe. That's the little green line over there. We have a lot to do to catch up with this. And we all need to work harder to push the frontiers in education. And this is not just about money. It also means that public policy needs to become so much better at identifying who are the key agents of change and to champion them, and to find more effective ways of scaling and disseminating innovation. And that's also about finding better ways to recognize, to reward, and to celebrate success, to do really whatever is possible to make it easier for innovators to take risks and encourage the emergence of truly transformational ideas. Thank you very much.
Andreas, thank you. There's a reason why this has the status of a flagship report. The implications are enormous. The promise is there before us. And before we gather in roundtable with a number of colleagues to comment on this report and how they see the promise and the power of technology supporting deep learning, there's a pre-recorded interview that you conducted with Andrew Ng. Would you like to just quickly introduce that interview or we go straight to the interview itself, Andreas?
I think you can get straight into this. Andrew Ng is the inventor of Coursera. That's probably the mother of learning platforms. So I think he's a great contributor to the field.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry.
Welcome, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining our conference. It's so great to catch up again. You are just a remarkable entrepreneur, the architect of Coursera. And I think it was almost exactly 10 years ago that you created an amazing platform that allowed anyone to access what was before only, available to a few people who could afford to go to university. You're one of the first people to imagine an educational future that would, unbundle educational content, delivery and accreditation, which usually creates the kind of monopolies with which universities extract a lot of money from people. But the technology behind your revolutionary vision was actually quite traditional still then. Today we have AI, we have learning analytics, we have blockchain technology. What's your vision for learning today? What do you see coming in terms of AI technology? What are reasonable expectations and what is just hype in your view?
Yeah, I think many universities are out to democratize access to education. And I think when we can build technology to democratize access to education. And I think when we can build technology platforms to play a small role supporting that, I think that's exciting. In terms of AI technology, there's been a lot of progress in AI, and I think the AI community has transformed consumer software internet companies. We use a web search engine, social media, those companies use AI very effectively. The next thing I hope we'll see in AI is AI breaking out of consumer software internet into all of the other industries, including education, but also things like manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, logistics, healthcare. All of those other industries are AI ready to varying degrees. I think an industry is usually more AI ready when there's more data. And the rise of online education, driven by the massively open online courses, and also with the global tragedy of COVID forcing more education to go online, I think that is creating a lot more digital data in the educational realm that makes that industry more AI ready. And I hope that over the next few years, we'll see more of this come to fruition. I think sometimes, and one interesting thing to me is higher ed, as one example, is very different than K-12. In higher ed, I think the biggest bottleneck is that there's still so much content that needs to be put online because higher ed content is so broad. Still have a lot of work to do to just get that catalog built, whereas the curriculum for K-12 is narrower, and that makes it easier, I think, to have highly personalized assistance, to put tons of effort to build a great AI to teach someone arithmetic, because a lot of people need to learn arithmetic. So I think we'll see AI have lots of developments, but at varying paces in K-12 versus in higher ed.
And where do you see sort of the challenges? Why did we see a lot of progress actually in post-secondary learning and actually relatively modest progress on this front in the K-12 education so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like digitizing content has made very good progress for both K-12 and for post-secondary learning. I think that adopting AI solutions is very early stages in both of these. I think that adult learning is relatively less regulated, and market dynamics, it just makes sense to have online content, to have enterprises, governments, individuals use that content to level up themselves and their corporations and the countries. K-12 historically has had a very complex set of market dynamics. And I think also with very young learners that are, like a 7-year-old that's less capable of self-regulating than an adult learner. I think that we've not yet hit on the right solutions for AI and digitalization to make its way. I find that when a digital AI solution doesn't make inroads into an industry, people tend to say, oh, it's because they're all sticks in the mud, they're really traditional, not willing to embrace technology. I find sometimes there is a small element of that, but to be perfectly candid, as a technologist, sometimes I feel like I look at the technology and say, we have not done a good enough job to figure out how to develop the product that actually makes sense for the K-12 context. So I hope we can get there collectively as a community.
Yeah, Andrew, I find your comparisons with other sectors really interesting. When it comes to sort of the use of technology, maybe also their social acceptance, where do you see the difference between education and other sectors? And, which of those differences do you think have a justification? Learning is a social or relational process. And, which of those are just, barriers to innovation that we should, get rid of? What's your view on that?
Yeah, so many parts of, in education, we have a very complex multi-stakeholder type of ecosystem where there are a lot of stakeholders that have the power to say no. And so when doing work in K-12, we're often having to design systems so that everyone is at least a little bit off and certainly not worse off so that an initiative doesn't get blocked. For myself, my primary loyalty is to the learner. I just want to do stuff that makes the learner better off. And where the tough challenges come in is whether we make the learner better off, but someone else, maybe not quite as well off. Those initiatives have a hard time going forward. But there's actually one major shortcoming of a lot of AI solutions today. Well, I think that collectively we've become pretty good at delivering content online. What we're not good at doing today, as far as I can tell, is delivering motivation. I think it's super clear to me that if learners spend time taking online classes, Khan Academy at the K-12 level, right, or other things, Coursera and other things at a higher ed level, many individuals will be much better off spending much more time on tasks. But people have a hard time doing that. So I think people are much better than most digital solutions at delivering that motivation and encouraging. And I think there's actually a problem that excites me. How do we help individuals do things that it's completely clear that many people would be better off if they spend more time investing in their own education, but it's difficult. It's like many people are much better off if they had healthy eating habits and then did more of this thing, less of that other thing. But that individual motivation, I think, is a big piece we need to solve.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And but I want to come back to the point you mentioned. The barriers. You described it as a kind of zero-sum game. Some people, obviously the learner is better off, but other people might be worse off. You think that's really the case? Doesn't AI transform teaching in the same way that transforms learning, giving teachers so much better insights how different students learn differently and giving them better tools to engage with different learning environments and making them creative designers of innovative learning environments, good coaches, good mentors. So why should we consider this a zero-sum game?
I don't think it has to be a zero-sum game. I don't know that anyone has developed a wonderful product that accomplishes all of the goals you just listed. And I think there's one thing. I feel like sometimes organizations have inertia and people need to be motivated to take the effort to learn a brand new way of doing things. And then also, I think candidly, I've also seen a lot of educational products that don't work as well as the people that built them think it does. I think most people are honest. When edtech entrepreneurs go and sell a story, I think they're actually trying to be honest and telling the truth. But unless you work in the K-12 system or the higher ed system and deeply understand all the nuances, what does it actually take to get a learner to stick with it? What do you do when a learner gets stuck? How do you design a system so that when they're stuck on a little problem, they can get the help they need to get unstuck? The math problem, why don't these numbers add up? I don't know. Well, how do you get them unstuck at those key moments? But the educational puzzle is so complex. I feel like the simple AI solutions, the simple tech solutions, certainly are not competitive with what a great teacher can deliver. Now, there's another question. What if the AI or the tech solution is better than the bottom 25% of teachers? I don't even know if we're there yet. But I think that there's a very complex design problem that I wish we collectively, were able to do an even better job designing these products that make sense, really most of all for the learner, but hopefully also for the teachers and the school system and for the other stakeholders.
Yeah, interesting. When it comes to automobiles, we have seen sort of a progression, from technology assisting drivers to partial automation, conditional automation, to pretty high levels of automation, actually, where drivers can, sit back and relax to some extent most of the time. How do you see that? You mentioned already, how do you see that evolving in education? What are the respective roles of AI and the educator? How do human intelligence and AI interrelate when it comes to education in your view with regard to the future?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't know. It's a great question. I wish I was smart enough to know the answer to that. Let me describe a couple possibilities that may or may not be right. I think, as you well know, Andreas, in developing economies, there often aren't qualified teachers at all, and thus I've seen adoption of digital and AI take off sometimes faster in developing economies, which are executing a leapfrog maneuver. In developed economies where there are, pretty highly skilled teachers available, transforming the system has sometimes been even a little bit more challenging. I would love to see more and more content delivered digitally. I remember actually teaching at Stanford. I was giving the same lecture year after year, walk in the same room, saying the same words, even telling the same jokes. And I think it's really clear to me that was not the best use. That wasn't the best way I could serve the learners. So I think a lot of content should move online. But then a lot of those moments, those highly custom moments where the student is stuck for some esoteric reason that AI has a harder time recognizing, to say, oh, did you know, long division actually works this way. You missed that number there, right? Those little moments of insight that AI isn't very good at yet. As well as the motivation, mentoring, the coaching. If we can create more space for teachers to do that, I think that would make the whole system more efficient to the benefit of the learner and others. Now, this vision of the flipped classroom has been around for a long time. I think, Sao Khan, huge fan as well, has been talking about it for a decade, longer than a decade, I think. I think that basic idea is still sound, but a lot of the execution and operational details of how to make it work, I feel like we still don't have that nailed down yet.
Yeah, maybe we need, not just the technologists, but more educators who actually become part of the design of those solutions and integrate, the kind of human and artificial intelligence at the point of design. But, to the pandemic, how do you think the pandemic has changed the edtech market, the solutions, the approaches? What do you think, should stay for good, and what is just, something that we used as a stopgap measure? You have your own views on that?
Yeah. So a lot of learning has moved online during the pandemic, and I think hard to say. I think more learning will stay online even after we're part of the pandemic. We've certainly seen a lot of bad attempts at using, Zoom and so on to do not very good online education as wonderful teachers, but really we're scrambling to try to make this work for the first time. But I'm actually excited that we now have millions of teachers, or hundreds of, hundreds of millions of teachers around the world that have tried to do online education and have gained some skill in it. And I think that it'll be exciting to see what further innovations come out of this global population of teachers and learners that have learned to do this thing, with some good results and some not so good results. I feel like the world is so different. We have so many different people at different states of wealth, different levels of access to teachers, different social networks, sometimes in physical communities with great schools, sometimes physically in a place without physical access to a great school. The world is so diverse. So I think that as a piece of the pie, online education will continue to grow. Although I think that I feel like clearly around the world, many learners missed out on the law of learning because of online education that wasn't executed effectively. But I hope that would create momentum for us to keep on figuring out how to do this better. Long term, I think that human-to-human interactions is very effective. But online education should not be the same as in-person education only over a video. There are lots of things you could do in online education that are easier to execute in online education than in in-person education, such as if a teacher asks a question and instead of one student getting to answer, how about if every single student gets to answer? You could do that much more easily in a digital medium. So I'm optimistic that even though COVID was a global tragedy, it may give us all a kick.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I hope people are listening to you. This is, I think, our future. Our schools today will be our, future society, our future economy tomorrow. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today.
Thank you, Andres. This is a real pleasure to be here.
Andres, thank you. And obviously, thank you to Andrew. And colleagues, we have completed a 1-hour session in which we have had the opportunity to hit the headlines of a remarkable new report and to gather perspectives from learners, from experts, an opportunity to really understand the nature of this flagship report and its significance for our learning systems. The second hour, I am delighted to be joined by a number of colleagues from across a range of jurisdictions who now will form effectively a roundtable. Now, I think it might just help if we all know who's in the room. So rather than perhaps immediately calling on each of you to present and perhaps introduce yourself at the beginning, I'm going to change perhaps the expectation and get each of you to introduce yourselves first. And now, can I just be clear? This is not an opportunity for a 10-minute introduction. I think a 2-minute introduction would be wonderful, but I mean this seriously because people will want to know where you are coming from in what is a fascinating debate, digital education for a strong recovery, a forward look. So let me first of all call on, and if you don't mind, colleagues, I'm going to use your first name, so it will be informal. Alondre, could you perhaps just introduce yourself, your role as Secretary of Education for Spain? Just say a word about yourself, then I'll return a little after we introduce everybody and ask you to begin a number of short contributions. But just first of all, a brief introduction. Alondre, can you hear me?
Oh?
Yes, please do. Just, yeah, please do. Just say a word about yourself.
I have two excuses. Well, my name is Alejandro Tiana. I have been for many years professor of education at the Spanish Open University. I have been several times seconded to the Ministry of Education. Now I am the Secretary of State for Education at the Spanish government. I have been the rector of the Spanish Open University, but I'm not. I'm now for 3 years working, trying to make decisions.
It's wonderful. It's great to have you with us. Thank you very much. Let me go. I'm reading across my screen, colleagues, so in no particular order. John Bangs. We think that you're off mute, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, okay, I'm on now.
Oh, we can now. Thank you very much.
John Bangs. I work with Education International. I'm a senior consultant there. I liaise with the OECD. I'm chair of the Trade Union Advisory Committee for Education and Skills, the TUAC group. And I was a teacher for 20 years in East London, mainly with children with special educational needs. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you very much, John. Stefan, you've already been acknowledged by Andreas as a significant force behind this report. So we do want to acknowledge your leadership and your scholarship. But just say a word about the role that you play at OECD CERI.
Yeah, I'm Stefan Vansanlanka. I'm a senior analyst at the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation. And actually, I've been working on technology. That was the first thing I did when I joined the OECD. It was a work on a chapter called Technology in Education in Education Policy Analysis at the time. And sometime afterwards, we've continued, and actually the technology we're talking about are no longer the same, but they're still there, and some of the challenges remain the same. So that's my short thing.
Thank you very much. Deborah, welcome. I think that people will recognize that you and I come from a similar geography in a moment. It's great to have you with us. Could you just let people know who you are and where you are?
Thanks, Tony. Yes, I'm Deborah Corrigan, and I'm a professor at the Faculty of Education at Monash University, which is in Australia. And I've also been a director of a centre within the university called Education Futures. But I suppose most of my work is, I'm particularly a science educator, but I've done a lot of work in policy area with governments on particularly curriculum and teacher education and teacher accreditation for initial teacher education. So, and I was originally a teacher in school.
Brilliant, thank you, Deborah. Maral, let me come to you. We have heard the significance of learner voice, and I would argue that in fact all of us better make sure we continue to learn. So I'm not wanting to distinguish between generations here, but it's fantastic to have you with us. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. So my name is Maral Kabir. I'm a second-year double degree student. I'm studying computer science at the University of Waterloo and business administration at Wilfrid Laurier University, both in Canada. Before that, I lived in Oman for 11 years. That's where I completed my international baccalaureate. And like Anthony said, I'm just here to give a student perspective today.
Thank you very much. Well, colleagues, this is a fantastic round table. Let me just remind you that we are in a position, I think, where you can reflect on all you've heard, but you'll have your own positions. If we've set this conversation up to tackle the question about digital education and its contribution to a strong recovery of our learning systems, because so many of us have been talking about the COVID environment, but let's not just reference the COVID environment. We've been talking about the need to redesign, reinvent, reimagine our learning systems for many years. There may well have been a stimulant here of a kind that we wouldn't have anticipated, and clearly we are looking for the lessons from our experience in the last couple of years. But here's the chance, I think, for each of you, just in 3 or 4 minutes in your opening remarks before we get into a roundtable conversation, just to lay out the way you see the potential here. Have we really got the opportunity for digital education to give us the kind of not only recovery, but future that we want for all young people? A strong learning system that will ensure economic prosperity, social cohesion, individual and collective well-being. I guess I should therefore ask at a level of country, given that we have a State Secretary of Education with us, we might give you the opening, dear sir, just to lay out how you see this situation. And I'm going to be as courteous as I can, but if you go much over about 4 minutes, I might just say, could you just close in the next few seconds? So forgive me if I intervene. Thank you very much. Alejandro.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me welcome and thank this futuristic view about digital education, because I have not had the opportunity to read all the document through all, but I have had a look, and it is really, really interesting. I have two observations because Andreas talked about futuristic view. But first observation is that future always arrives and becomes present. And this is something, having worked in education, has seen several times in my personal professional life. And second is that future and futuristic comes sometimes very quickly, as it is now the time due to the pandemic and this shock. So I'm from the view of a policymaker, I have to recognize that change is a non-easy task. I have been thinking about a lot of time before, but now I have to make decisions. And the reality is that educational systems are really big bodies, not easy to manage and to change. And this is a reality. Spain is not a huge country, but we have more than 10 million students and more than 800,000 teachers and professors. So it's not easy to change that. In reality, education systems are not unidimensional mechanisms, but directed top-down, as some people imagine, but cooperative enterprises, many actors and participants. So many of us are convinced of the benefits of fostering the use of digitalization in education, but also we know the challenges. And Andreas put it very clearly, and I have nothing to add to that. But so the question for us is how to proceed. And I can give 3 lines we are not trying to develop, just as some lines. First, we are trying to develop the digital competence of all educational actors, which means, in fact, to act on the field of teacher training and the field of curriculum. And we are involved as a country now in these 2 issues, because this is a base without which it is not impossible to go ahead. Second is to support, promote, and disseminate innovation in this field, because it is not only having some bright people, clever people doing that, but fostering this cooperation. And the third line is to organize specialized teams to work on the raising issues related to the management of learning processes, but also of management of schools and the whole system. So these are 3 lines of work, 3 strategies we are trying to develop now in Spain at this very moment.
Alejandro, let me ask you this. I think Andrew mentioned at the end of the interview with Andreas that it's a very complex multi-stakeholder ecosystem. Yeah. And when you talk about your 3 lines of work, in particular your first line, digital competence for all actors, that is a very significant ambition. What's the politics of education around that?
Well, we think Andreas has, well, according to the report, has presented a lot of work, blockchain, robots, and so on and so forth. And it is very interesting. And we have in Spain, of course, as many countries, I think in some countries more than in Spain, but we have people knowing about that and developing this issue. But the issue is that we have so huge a system that we have to try to develop that on a general basis, more to say. So we have been working these years before on plans, for instance, for teacher digital competence. But now the situation is that we are now much more in a position to develop that. So the ideas we have worked on in the last years, now we have developed that into more comprehensive plans to be developed in the coming years. And well, we will take profit of the recovery funds from the European Union to invest in that. And so in all this plan, we are developing a plan for the development of digital competence, not only of teachers, which is crucial, but also students and also families and so on. So all the educational community should need some attention.
Yeah, this is, well, John, I don't want to attempt in any way to frame what you're going to say. I just want to make a link because the centrality of the profession is clear, but they're not the only actors. And I know that in other forums, particularly our International Summit on the Teaching Profession, where we have a partnership between ministers and teacher union leaders, thinking about how that partnership can support the advancement of learning generally, but particularly in this space, support the way in which we are going to be able to harness the power of technology. But so many people do come back and talk about the central role of the teaching profession. So I'm going to be fascinated with how you position this.
Okay, all right. That's a very good pass, actually, Tony. Thank you very much. Well, can I just say I welcome the report. I think it's exceptionally good at describing the technologies available. And there's some very, very interesting references to, for instance, empowering students to learn, particularly those with special educational needs, and opening up the world really to the classroom. And I think that is a very, very important point to make. I think to take your cue, Tony, the theme of this session was about reimagining education. I think schools during the pandemic and teachers and support staff and parents have been involved in amazing micro innovation because they've had to. And in fact, education at school level in local communities has been reimagined consistently. I have to say it's an enormous research opportunity for all those around the table as well, and the research community. And what I would say, though, is bearing that in mind and the fact that students themselves have been reimagining. I mean, you think about the WhatsApp groups that they've been putting together, many classes of students, for example. That's the positive side. The negative side is that we all know that there are those students who have been able to do that and those schools that haven't been able to do that either, and the gap has widened. I think the one thing that we've learned, and I do want to emphasize this actually, and we have this in our principles for effective educational quality, the principles for education recovery. You referred earlier, Tony, I think, when we're in private conversation, we have a webinar on the 11th of June, a joint webinar between the OECD and EI on those principles. And we can explore those further. But the one thing that comes out strongly, and ask any parent, is how important schools and their communities are to the future of education. The role of schools has been emphasized. So the issue is, what is the relationship of technology to school communities, it seems to me? And how do we learn from the micro innovations that I referred to? And I think the conditions are there for collaboration. And we know from all our work, and I know OECD does as well, that where there has been positive collaboration between the teaching profession, their organizations and governments on educational recovery, there you have the most fertile possibilities for innovation, bottom-up innovation. And bearing in mind, I know we have other colleagues who want to come in. I'll give you one example. I think Andrew Ng actually referred to professional development. So did Andreas as well. We had just-in-time professional development that teachers were involved in there and then, right the way through this last year. And I think we need to systematize how that has happened and what we need to use. And I do think teachers and their organizations, in partnership with government, should put professional development and learning at the center stage. It's always, actually, or with very many governments, professional development is the first default position for a cut if there are problems with funding. And I think we need to shift that paradigm as well. And we certainly need to empower teachers to assert their own professionalism within school communities. So I think we're at a moment with the way in which the pandemic has rolled out, but people and communities coping with it. We're at a moment where actually collaboration between school communities and policymakers is really at the optimum, and we actually have the ability to get hold of it, particularly in the area of putting together remote infrastructures for remote learning that can be used at the service of school communities. Thank you, Tony.
John, let me just before I go to Deborah, and just to give people the sequence, just so you're aware that it's not just me that has a sequence in mind of speakers. So, Maral, I'm going to ask you to come in after Deborah, and then Stefan, can I come to you because I think that you're in a unique position to not only make a contribution, but perhaps to also pick up on some threads that are emerging here. But John, I just want to put a challenge to you because Alejandro said, listen, we have got a ministry, we've got a government that's going to invest, that's planning, that's thinking seriously about how we are going to be able to ensure that digital education becomes a reality. At a level of Education International, and I don't want to go into the territory of the seminar that's coming up in a couple of days, but at the level of Education International, how do you see the reshaping of the profession to be precisely the kind of agents that Andreas referred to? This is when we talk about the design of learning experiences fueled and charged by technology. I take your point entirely about the reality of the micro and the importance of the school community, but this is actually a serious shift for the entire profession, surely. And how do we get the kind of appetite and the support for that kind of shift? Do you think that shift is just going to come, I don't mean just, but it's going to come essentially at the local level? What are the other forces that will effectively reimagine, to use your language, the whole of the teaching profession? I mean, am I overstating this?
No, you're not. And in fact, many of our member organizations in EI have been doing precisely that. I mean, they've been producing the most amazing online professional development for their teachers. And I do think, without being, and I think it would be the worst thing to happen actually if we had in every country solely a single central negotiating and consultative body. I do think there's a necessity for devolution, and obviously the Minister Alejandro knows that, bearing in mind the devolved nature in Spain of the educational provision there, that actually we ought to be looking at robust consultative and negotiating structures between teachers and their organizations, which are also sensitive to what's coming up from schools and what we've learned. I think there needs to be a re-examination of the procedures and relationships there are between school communities, and we mustn't forget parents in this situation as well. And I do think at local level, so that it's handleable, there should be a stimulus from national organizations, whether it's governments or whether it's teacher unions or whether it's parents organizations or anyone connected, towards having structures which are handleable at local level, so we can start actually looking at how we start to learn and using that actually. So I do think that's a big way forward.
Yeah, Deborah, just give me 1 second. I just want to, Alejandro, can I just ask you to comment on the importance of the partnership between government and the profession, unions? I take it in your own case that is very much factored into your plans.
Well, yes, I think that this is something crucial, as you know. You know, John knows teacher unions in Spain and what the kind of connections we have. But well, for me, there is a key issue when making change feasible, is that teachers should understand that we are not devaluating their profession or what they know. So if we are now involved in a new curriculum, and one key issue is to send the message that the knowledge of teachers is highly valuable, and we are trying to change, but not telling them what you know and what you do is not worth. No, not at all. It works, but we need to go ahead and for keeping this how do I say, complicity, we need to work with them, and we need to exchange, and we need to make our plans clear and so on. Well, it is not easy to work with everybody happy. We have a lot of, you know, John, you know, we have a lot of teachers unions, and well, sometimes there are also worries, no, and problems. But I think this is a key issue. And one of, at this very moment, we are sending the message, not telling that, but doing that we are taking, trusting on teachers to do the new curricula and so on and so forth. If we succeed in that, it will be successful. If not, we will have problems in the coming future. It's my view.
No, thank you. That's a fantastic connection. I think that we just need to think about the conditions for the harnessing of this power. Deborah, again, can I just make a kind of a connecting point in my own mind, and that was the exchange between Andreas and Andrew about what we've seen in higher education at the tertiary sector, and then a comparison with a K-12, a P-12 school sector, and even early childhood. You've got a bit of a unique perspective on this because you cover in your work all sectors. So I'm going to be fascinated to see where you stand on this.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I suppose I'd like to congratulate the document. I think the Digital Education Outlook is really opening up possibilities for moving forward. But I suppose just to connect all of those things, I wanted to start with students first and then move to teachers and educators, and then things like initial teacher education, just briefly. So one of the things that we've found from the COVID experience is that in Victoria, in Australia, my state, we had students who were missing school for 22 weeks. They were online predominantly, or mixtures thereof. Now, there were some real positives about it. There were some absolute negatives. A lot of students in rural and remote regions did really well in an online environment. Many students in more metro situations didn't. And what we've got now is a real mixing of people don't think that digitisation is any different from online. So there's a really big education process about, you know, saying what is different about digitisation and what is different about online. Parents and students don't necessarily understand that difference, and sometimes either do teachers, for that matter. So that's a really big issue to start with. The other thing that we've found is that social interactions were fundamentally important, but at the same time, people started to value their privacy a lot more. And so what we found here is that not only have kids started because they haven't had each other, their peers as moderators of their behaviour is being unusual when they return to school. The social interactions and the norms around that have to be re-established. And things have to really start to be reimagined in different ways, because now students are also more savvy consumers because they know what can be done online and they know what can't be done online. So teachers are also in the bind of, so we've got a different learning community here that we have to adapt to. And I suppose I go back to Andreas's question then when I turn to teachers, is to, Andreas asked, how can teachers be transformational? I think there's actually a bigger question. I think we actually have to decide what is the role of a teacher? How do we define a teacher? And I think a teacher's got to be very different moving forward. because we know that teachers are really good at learning and focusing on the learning of their students. They're not so great at marshalling the myriad of opportunities that they can bring into their classroom. And I know, just working with teachers in online environments, that they often partner up with somebody else. So somebody's monitoring the technical aspect of the online and they're doing the more social interactions part of it. So they actually also have to take a real leading role in being the educational designer of what's going on in the classroom. So they can work with others to do that. But they're hampered in that because for many jurisdictions, the system and the registration and accreditation systems that they operate in them don't allow them to do that. And so I think we really have to redefine what is the role of a teacher. And I think one of the things that is great about higher education is that we while we're still highly regulated in that area in Australia, we are less regulated than school systems are. And that starts to show us the opportunities that are possible. And so I'm conscious of the fact that in higher education, even teacher education students who are going to be teachers have become quite sophisticated learners in virtual environments, not only because of COVID, but also because of the mass education in higher ed and the less jurisdiction we have. So the other thing, just in terms of initial teacher education, just moving quickly to that, is that I think we also have to start looking at the accreditation systems. So the systems that are largely from government, designed by the system, who have a very traditional view of what is a teacher in mind, also have very tight regulations. And so those opportunities for digitising and utilising those digital tools in the classroom is always dampened down by lack of opportunity and experience because of what society sees as the expectations of a teacher.
Let me just, Maral, just give me one moment. I can't let this go by without saying to John, as you listen to Deborah about the challenge here of rethinking the role of teachers and the enabling conditions, and I take your point entirely, Deborah, there are so many structural and functional issues that could be seen to be inhibitors. And I hear what you're saying is that you need to address a number of features of learning environments and a number of features of how we think about the recruitment, preparation, and continued support of teachers. John, are you listening to this in a way that says yes? There is no question that we'll need to think about not only the way in which the profession does its work, but actually how it fundamentally might need to recast the role of teachers.
Well, I think there is so much rich evidence about how teachers have operated during the pandemic that needs to be drawn on. I think the last teachers would want to hear is the phrase, with respect, Deborah, I know your point, but is that teachers need to actually reinvent themselves. I think those two paradigms are probably not what we should be looking at. I think what we need to be looking at is how do we draw on the evidence of what's worked and what are the structures and relationships that we have to establish to make sure that evidence has the greatest impact, whether it's councils at a local level or a national level, whether it's partnerships. It has to be done on the basis of trust and what I would call positive pluralism. The fact that everyone's involved in actually trying to solve problems. All I know is that that online learning during the pandemic was just-in-time learning, and lots of students benefited from it, and lots of students also invented new ways of talking to each other. But the relief that students have at getting back to school is palpable, actually. And if you talk to those students who were able to be in school, largely because their parents were involved in frontline services, and that's where they had to be, that minority. If you ask them, that's where they want to be. And the relationships that they then developed with their teachers during that phase were often probably the most positive relationships that there were there. And so the role of technology in relation to that, the best role of technology was to support the development of those relationships. And that's what I want to learn. So I'm not sure that general imprecations for the profession to reinvent itself in the future, or that we need to reinvent the role of teachers, is the right paradigm we need to be thinking about. I think it's about how do we learn is the most important thing. How does the system learn from the evidence that it's got?
Deborah, you want to come back?
May I just want to clarify a point. I don't think teachers have to rethink what they're doing. I think it's actually the society has to think about how they define teachers. And so teachers have learned lots from the pandemic. It's not about them redefining their role. It's actually about the society has a very locked in view about what a teacher does. What the pandemic did was suddenly said, well, parents were the first ones to say, I'm glad I'm not a teacher. That in itself starts to open up the conversation about how society defines a teacher, or teaching would be better. And so I think it's about the societal expectation of what do we want from teaching, and that's the important issue here.
Well, Maral, I want to bring you in here because there's a few different levels of expectation. I heard on the voices of learners in the opening of this session that they've got a few expectations. They certainly have some expectations on those who are going to be in partnership with them on their learning, and that does include teachers. And they do expect teachers, the profession, to be harnessing the power of technology, not necessarily every new invention, but certainly to make the distinction, Deborah, that you have, to go beyond online. Yeah? I mean, this report, I just might remind us, Stefan, because you did, is pushing the frontiers with AI, blockchain, and robots. So, Maral, tell me this from a learner perspective. Yep. How are you seeing this report? Is it giving us the direction that we need in order to make this learning process so much more powerful for you as a learner? What are the implications for your partnership with other learners? What are the implications for your relationship with the technology itself? I'm going to be fascinated with your views.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think this report is kind of exactly what we needed, and it really echoed a lot of student perspectives of kind of how they visualize education to be and how they see kind of artificial intelligence and all of these tools can be used to support their learning. I think there is a sort of kind of pressure on teachers kind of learn how to use these technologies, because students do hope that soon they will be able to use artificial intelligence to kind of personalize their education. And so teachers will have to kind of start to learn to adapt these technologies. But I think I really do agree with Deborah's point that the kind of idea of a teacher will kind of change, and it's kind of changing students' minds, especially after the pandemic. We see teachers more like a support system right now. I think the pandemic showed me that, I can use other systems to actually learn the content of my education, but I really always do need a professor for the emotional support to actually answer my questions to a more personal level. And so I think that the role of the teacher will kind of change that way. Even if they aren't able to fully adopt to the technologies, their role will still be there, just in a more mentorship sort of level.
Well, let me just push you a little bit on this, because in a way, this conversation has quite naturally focused upon all of the actors, and obviously educators are front and center in the transformation that we're talking about. But say a little more about how you see your own responsibility. I'm wanting to get a sense of not only your own responsibility, but your own demands of the learning system. Are you optimistic that, having looked at this latest digital education outlook, that we are looking at the potential, seriously looking at the potential of redesigning our learning system in the interest of young people? Because Andreas was arguing earlier on, this does give us the chance for personalization at a completely different level. It does give us the chance to address the learning challenges that we all have in one form or another. It does give us the chance to look at the power of data and learning analytics in order to assist us in our learning, to accelerate our learning. It does give us the chance to actually address the equity questions that every young person raised as being a fundamental moral and ethical responsibility. So where do you sort of stand on this agenda?
Yeah, for sure. I think the main thing that every student has as an expectation is that we all want our education to be personalized. You know, in this day and age, everything we have is personalized. Our social media feed, just even my shampoo is personalized to, you know, my hair. Like everything in life is personalized now, and education isn't like that right now. And it's one of the main aspects of our life. And so students really want everything to be personalized, the sort of questions that they're receiving, the sort of feedback that they're receiving, their pace of education. And so I think that this whole AI, everything that's been discussed in the report is really moving in that direction. And I personally really believe that it can really help us personalize our education. And I think for a lot of young people, including myself, which I'll talk about a bit later, I think one of the most exciting things of using this technology is that it can really help us create a more equal education playing field around the world, that this technology can even help those in developing countries to become more equal, because the digital divide is really increasing across the world, and the divide of education, and that we have the potential of using this technology to not forget about those who may not have access, you know, to the best resources right now.
Yeah, just before I come to Stefan, can I just ask maybe both Deborah and yourself, because this was an issue that, again, Andreas raised around the blockchain technology that can seriously assist us when we think about some of the huge challenges for recognizing learning, the way in which that's captured, thinking about credentialing, all of those dynamics that at the moment are somewhat, I think, bedeviling young people as they think about their learning pathways, particularly as they move from senior secondary in a school system into further learning and into work, and the ways in which we have constraints at the moment on how learning is recognized, narrow definitions of success. Deborah, to you first, do you feel that there's real potential here, that technology can seriously help young people on their learning journeys and to be recognized in ways that are going to be particularly helpful to their learning?
Yes. Yes, in fact, I was really encouraged by the blockchain part of the report, because I see a lot of young people lose their way. They do a lot of things, but they never actually know how to put them together. So, yeah. I mean, a lot of my role at university is actually about, you know, you read enough CVs or enough things and you sort of say, so, but what's your story here? How do you put it all together? I think if we can take some of the blockchain technology, for example, around credentialing, this enables people to actually take back their control over their pathways and their learning trajectories. And I think that's fundamentally important.
Yeah. Maral, have you got a comment on that just before I go to Stefan?
I'm not an expert in blockchain, but from what I've read in the report, I think it all just seems very promising for students as well, just to take back that sort of ownership.
Well, Stefan, this is where whatever you're going to say, can you add something about the way in which you'd hope this report would inspire a level of discourse and conversation, which I think Deborah has pointed out, that it takes us beyond an online definition. It takes us into the full power of digitization. And as you pointed out in this report, it's going to be fueled by AI, by blockchain, by robots. Are you feeling that this conversation is, in a sense, really appreciating the power of this digital education outlook? Because it feels of a different order to many of us who have read it. It's not just the next iteration. It's not a bit of incrementalism. It feels like the game changer, right, is being laid out. Now, I'm talking it up here, Stefan, for you.
Yeah, I think that what's important in the report is really to show that things are already there, and that these technologies are being developed and they will continue. The question is really how we use them, as part of the school system. So perhaps if I actually one thing, for example, that it changes, it's not just the role of how we should think about a teacher, but sometimes how we should think about what should be learned in school. I say Alejandro has a new curriculum in his background, but there are a lot of new skills that can actually be learned thanks to technology that couldn't be done before, and this is really, the question is, should that also be acknowledged in school, be part of what people learn there, or should it, just be something outside of school that will be, credentialed thanks to blockchain, for example? So there are a lot of new possibilities that are being opened in terms of, what's happening in school, what's happening outside of school. And I think that, when John talked about the communities and how to, that's one of the things that we've learned during the pandemic, and so how to re-engage and to think differently about, this relationship between what's happening in school and what's happening outside of school. That's really one of the things that, a lot of these technologies are making possible. Another aspect is, so to get back to what Alejandro said on the difficulties of change. So it's true, technology has been there. Education systems are difficult to change. There is no doubt everything is difficult, and we can imagine a lot of possible scenarios. I'm a bit like Andrew, I want to be optimistic. But what I know is that, these technology are there, they will continue. So one possibility would be, that they will continue mainly out of school, as they currently are developed, mainly for tutoring, after school, for a lot of possibilities. And that we are just going to use them in such a way that, they're not going to transform education, as Andrea said, but more help to replicate the way things are being done, perhaps with a little bit of possibilities in case of the next pandemic, so we'll be more used to that. But there are a lot of other possibilities. One is actually that even if it doesn't change much the social aspects of schooling, which is very structured, there is a strong expectation about what it means to be in school, etc. But there is a strong expectation about what it means, for example, to fly. And when you go in a plane now and when you went in a plane 30 years ago, it's two very different animals, and just because there are sensors, there are a lot of the ways that, the information that is given to everyone is different. So the technology could quite be invisible, as Andrea said, but still very informative, giving a lot of feedback to everyone. And even if it doesn't change fundamentally the appearance of the social experience of schooling. And then we can imagine something quite different too, where we use time and space in a totally different way, where the supplementarities between technology and what humans are doing and how we interact become quite different, when we, for example, students don't have to go to school all the time, or we use the time very differently when we go there. And that is really something for us to reimagine, because that's a social change. It's not just a school change, that's a social change that also relates to other changes in the labor market, for example. And I believe, we are really at a time when we can think about that. We've lived an interesting experience where we've changed our ways of living for 1 year and something. We have been exposed to a lot of the technology. We've reinvented a lot of ways to learn, to teach, to do things during this time. And we also know that there are all these tools which are coming, which are not always fully developed. So I would really like to say that, like Andrew, that when he said, "Oh, I'm not sure we've done a good job enough," sometimes that's a problem of technology, that the products are not yet, developed the way we would want. And so working collaboratively to actually try to go to that next step, I believe is really one of the things that we would like to inspire people. That's really what the objective of this report is about.
Well, I want to ask, I'm watching the time, colleagues, and I want to ask Andreas a question. But Andreas, you can completely ignore it, and you might want to say, no, hold on. The 2 or 3 things that I would like to reflect on in this conversation are the following. But I just want to put this question out there and then ask any of my colleagues if you want to have a 30-second, and I literally mean a 30-second comment that needs to be said. And my question really is, this is fascinating because, Andreas, you said, I think at a particular moment, let us appreciate the importance of the entire ecosystem here, right? We're talking about a learning system that, sure, schools are and their communities are vital, but they're not the only players in this ecosystem. And if I hear you correctly, Stefan, formal, informal, non-formal, more permeable boundaries, other players that all will be supported by technology is crucial. Yep, so let's share the responsibility here. And I want to ask Andreas whether that is the way in which you're thinking about a digital education that is forward-looking, the ecosystem issue. But just before I do, is there a 30-second comment, because I'm going to finish with Andreas, is there a 30-second comment that you might, colleagues, want to make about this, that the future, some statement, John, that you want to, I can see you coming in, 30 seconds, something about the future that must be said before we go to Andreas. You're on mute, my friend.
I was, okay. Deborah and I had an interesting exchange earlier. It wasn't an oppositional exchange. The issue actually is about how we raise the collective efficacy levels of educational communities, whether they're schools or wider communities, to change. It's about the educational efficacy levels and who actually owns them. That's the big issue.
Got it. Please.
Schools are an education system is a part of a wider social ecosystem. And so trying to develop digital education will not succeed. It is not connected to the digitalization of society as a whole and labor market and production system and so on and so forth. And for me, this is a key point.
Thank you. Deborah?
Yes, so for me, it always comes back to purpose. So you engage in these sorts of activities for a purpose, regardless whether you're in the community, in business, as a learner, as a teacher, whatever. So you'll engage in it, you'll use it if it has a purpose. And I think that becomes incredibly important to clarify.
Thank you. Maral?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the biggest problem with online education right now is that we're trying to recreate a classroom environment, but the most exciting thing about this report and this whole conversation is using this technology to move forward from kind of what our classrooms look like right now and really trying to revolutionize that. And so that's just kind of what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Andreas, I've got a question on the table, but take it as you would like to.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a relevant question, the ecosystems approach, but I think Miral has given the right answer to this. If we actually put learner agency at the center and we seek to give greater ownership to people over how they learn, when they learn, what they learn and why they learn, then we can naturally compose that ecosystem around it. Then we can ask ourselves, what are the right learning environments to foster this? What are the institutions that can best support it? But I think that is the real transformation. And I think the amazing opportunity that digitalization provides is that for the very first time, we can connect the bits and pieces of this ecosystem. In the past, there were heavy institutions, built outside around it. But now, teachers can understand how different students learn differently. And we can actually, support teachers in novel ways. So I sort of very much take John's points. This shouldn't come from the outside towards teachers. But I think it's an empowering tool. The transformation will come from that, sense of learner ownership. One point that Alejandro made that also struck me really is, the future is going to be here faster than any of us imagine. And we have to become better to think in terms of alternative futures, to prepare ourselves for different kinds of scenarios, evolutions. And I think if we are better at this, more agile in our thinking about, that broader ecosystem, we will probably also be better prepared for the future that will eventually arrive. The point that John made, an ecosystem is not about, just different parts. It's about different parts working effectively together. And the way in which the teaching profession, collaborates as a profession, but also interacts, with students, with parents, with the broader environment, with public policy, that will ultimately shape that broader ecosystem. And again, it's something where digitalization offers us enormous opportunities. There is no automaticity in this. Digitalization can also lead to more fragmentation, more isolation, more scripting of learning. I think this is a deliberate design process that is really being needed. But I think Miral brought it out best. It's about, changing mindsets and to foster learner agency. And if we take that to heart, digitalization provides us all of the opportunities. It is affecting, it is providing for every worker in every context enormous opportunities to grow. We can see, that digitalization is just, giving ways to extract so much better the human nature of people. And I think that's something that we should take to heart. And I think, as Miral also said, education needs to become better to personalize learning, like it has happened with everything in our lives. And it's not so much about, blockchain technology, it's about the blockchain philosophy, that basically you learn in different chunks and pits, and you can, compose your own learning pathway. You can design your own learning environment, and you will have effective support systems, around you to help you with this, whether it's parents, whether it's teachers, whether it's other kind of personnel. And I think if, digitally connects us better and makes, activates, that human nature, I do believe we can design that ecosystem that will ultimately produce better learning, and that also will remain dynamic. That's also, I think, so fundamentally important. It's not about designing one new system for digitalization. No, digitalization is going to change our lives every day and every day afresh, and I think that's the system that we have to create. And the opportunities are there, and the opportunities are real. But once again, I don't think there is any automaticity in this. In fact, digitalization, it can go either way. Artificial intelligence is not a magic power. It's just a great amplifier and accelerator. It will accelerate, great practice and great ideas in the same way as it can amplify bad ideas and bad practice. It will, be the human nature that will determine, whether it's going to be a force for good or not. No.
Andreas, thank you. Well, colleagues, this brings us to the end of our opening session. Alejandro, John, Stefan, Deborah, Miral, thank you very much for participating in this roundtable. Obviously, we pass our thanks also to the Deputy Director General, to Andrew for a fantastic interview, Andreas, and to the voices of learners that helped us to set the context for this session. Stefan, congratulations again to you and the team for a fantastic report, and Andreas for bringing us together in this way for a brilliant conference that now is going to flow over multiple sessions. But at this moment, I know that I speak on behalf of all of us who have been part of this 2 hours, literally to the minute, colleagues. I speak on behalf of all colleagues across jurisdictions in thanking you for a fantastic opening session, a brilliant report, and a real sense, I think, of promise that digital education will be contributing seriously to the strong recovery of our learning systems. And we do have a futures perspective, Andreas, that has been articulated so clearly. So thank you very much.